Hey, thank you, Jesse. I have to, admire the way you're able to, I'm going to use the word breakthrough, but I mean it in a different kind. The way you're able to break through to the simple in a kind of wildly complex set of issues. It is so valuable, both to conversation and also to decision making. I think you've reminded us of a lesson that it's apparently very easy to forget, that it's a multivariate world, right? And the kind of myopia, consequential myopia that can arise, not just actually from intuitions about linearity. I actually think your strongest graphic, your kind of most shocking, arresting, memorable graphic, is one of those, is the late graphic with the three not just nonlinear, but non-monotonic, right, kinds of changes. And I think probably many might agree that the most arresting image is actually that there's a green peak on that curve, right? But you don't stop there, right? You go on to kind of explain the interactions and mechanisms that help account for that, and then lead to my favorite part, which is the policy guidance that comes forward. That I think certainly something that's near and dear to us at the Kleinman Center is something that you mentioned, and I would just call out, which is that, especially in the face of decision making under deep uncertainty, it's really less about optimality than it is about robustness, right? About the ability of us to kind of resist making decisions, frankly, before we have to, right? Interactive kind of feedback from an emerging future, a very design thinking kind of concept. And that's great guidance in general, but I think you make the case for it spectacularly on this issue. So thanks very much. I got a bunch of questions, but I also am going to let Rob ask the first one.
Hey, Rob.
Go back to the slide that Mark was talking about, which I believe is number 41.
The question I have about this is there's another dimension going with this, which is time.
Yeah.
And this is a percentage of energy share as opposed to total generation. So the question is, if you time the decrease in emissions limits together with the, as you were saying, doubling in electricity capacity, you don't necessarily have to abandon renewable resources, right? They could make up they could be 70% at one time and 50% at another time, but if the generations are increasing at the same time, you might not have any abandoning of resources. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, that's a great insight. This is a snapshot study, so we're modeling the same year in the future with the same demand, just changing the emissions limits. We really want to, this shocked us when we saw it. We said, we really need to dive into this further. And the next step is to look at a dynamic study where we're planning out over 5-year increments, with some foresightedness. And indeed with changes in demand and demand profiles and technology costs over that time period. So it may be, and this is why I said in the extreme case, it may be we lock into things that make it harder. That's not guaranteed. And I think we need to push that and explore that more. And you raise a great point, which is that, you may be that this, share here falls naturally as we double the energy mix and we have plenty. The other thing to point out is that, these technologies don't last forever. We repower wind farms. We, might be okay shutting down a solar or wind farm. So it might be okay to overbuild in the short run and then turn them off. But I think we need to know that that's where we're headed and that might happen. I also wanted to point out that this is what happens when you deploy nuclear or geothermal or hydro, another resource with no fuel cost. If we can make carbon capture work and we can use natural gas or coal in this mix, then the fuel-saving value of the renewables is more preserved. It does decline because you stop facing the CO2 penalty as you move to low carbon. So in this study, we actually modeled natural gas with combined cycle also. And some of the revisions we're making as part of the reviewer comments are adding hydropower with reservoirs and solar with thermal energy storage or concentrating solar. And I think that we'll see the same dynamic. But so it really depends on, is this a fuel-consuming resource or not? Whether you see this really steep decline, you see a much more gradual decline in the renewable shares if it's paired with gas and carbon capture. So it really depends on where we're going. And the point is to say this could happen. This is something we need to think much more about and need to be careful about in our policymaking. So I wouldn't say this argues slow down with renewable deployment. I would say I would argue this, the overall study would argue don't set a 100% renewable portfolio requirement, which some states are debating doing. Set a 100% zero carbon requirement and then see what technologies move forward. But I think we're going to see a lot of growth in wind and solar, and it's going to contribute a lot to the future mix going forward.
Yes.
Hi, Ariel Marin. Thanks for that. You know, it's interesting. There's so much interest in 100 renewable energy goal, at least at the city levels, because of the simple messaging. Just going back to your point about simple. But for those cities and entities that have actually done the modeling and done the plan, they know 100 renewable energy is not possible. You know, if we did it for the city of New York, working with BCG to do the least cost modeling, and found to achieve the 80 by 50 goal, we were New York City and actually New York State, and everyone gets electricity from, has to get to a 70% to 80% renewable grid. And this assumes nuclear goes away, because New York State says nuclear goes away, and nuclear is not attractive. So my question for you then is, in your modeling, you know, this shows what it looks like if we completely move away from fossil fuels. And obviously the goal is to transition away from fossil fuels. But have you done a set of modeling that kept fossil fuels at a 5%, 10%, or 15%, and how that changes these curves?
No, I haven't done that yet, and that's another thing we're thinking about doing, is both constraining the floor on the fossil share and limiting the nuclear share or the low carbon share, because I mean, I personally don't find it credible that we're going to have a 70% nuclear powered system going forward, at least given the way the nuclear industry is progressing today. I mean, France has done it. It's technically feasible. We could if we had sufficient commitment, but that feels a little far-fetched to me. And so I'm wondering, if we say, what if it's only 30%, how much does the cost go up? Or how much do we need to rely on other flexible-based technologies? So I think those are really interesting questions to ask further, and particularly for regions that have decided that they don't want to have any future nuclear power.
New York State found it's more realistic to consider 100% renewable than to consider any more nuclear, from their point of view.
Yeah, I mean, this is what California has decided, in Germany, and I think in Germany's case, at least, that's not been the best decision from a CO2 perspective, if we just look empirically at how emissions have progressed in that country. And I think we're going to face the same challenges in places like New York and California. New York, at least, is preserving some of their upstate nuclear plants as they try to build on that foundation and ramp renewables to 50% by 2030. They're still closing Indian Point, which is a substantial share of the overall state's energy mix. There's not a clear plan to how to replace that quickly. And Massachusetts is closing Pilgrim, which is our one nuclear plant, without a clear plan to how to replace it, except for hydro from Quebec. And there's debates about whether we want to do that or not. So these are the kinds of trade-offs we face. And I think that, you know, renewables are attractive, and they have their benefits in the overall multi-objective function, as I mentioned, and they're most affordable options we have today. But if we want to really get to zero carbon, and we care about climate change, or we think that it's an existential crisis, like many do, then we probably have to look at a wider range of options than just wind or solar.
Okay, I'm going to run the implicit queue of people willing to keep their hands up for so long. So walk Christina, and then 2, and then 3, and then Sunny.
Oh, thanks. The great presentation, Jesse. Really wonderful. So I had 3 quick questions. Flexible baseload, coal and nuclear operating as flexible baseload. You said that is something that the industry can do now. I've never heard that before, so that would be one thing to address. 2, what do you expect market design-wise? I mean, a lot of this assumes a market environment based on LMP, but looking forward at a zero marginal cost renewable world where you're getting almost nothing from the energy market, how does the market have to change and value flexibility and all these other things? And then a third question, which I can just put on pause, but queue. We got a queue. I'll leave it there.
Just, those are easy, quick questions. I'll knock those out and we can move on. No, I'm just kidding.
I'll move on.
So the first one is relatively straightforward. So yes, nuclear plants are way more flexible than most people in the United States think they are. France built enough nuclear power that they have to ramp their nuclear power plants, not all of them, but some of them, to follow load or demand throughout the year. And so a bunch of their plants have been retrofit to have a more flexible configuration of control rods that can modulate the output from the plants. And they regularly do this. And you can look at the output from the nuclear stations, and they go up and down, and they follow load, and they follow the seasons. I've been working with colleagues at Argonne National Laboratory to look at how we would do that in the United States and what the value is. We have another paper will be published shortly on the value of doing this in a US context with lots of wind or solar. And in Germany, where we now have substantial wind and solar penetration and prices going negative, the plants in Bavaria, the nuclear plants there, have started to operate flexibly. And there are different mechanisms by which, a pressurized water reactor versus a boiling water reactor versus a CANDU Canadian reactor modulate their output, but all of them were built originally and designed with the idea that they would take over the energy system, and so they had to be flexible. So all the engineering that went in on the front end of these technologies assumed they would be 80% of our supply or something like that. So very ambitious engineers designing in a lot more technical capability than there's been any economic rationale for yet. So the reason we don't operate nuclear plants flexibly in the United States is because there's a minimum base load that we never go below, and prices don't fall below the marginal cost of nuclear very often. So there's no economic rationale to change your output. That is changing in Germany, in the Midwest. Exelon is starting to operate 2 of their plants in Illinois in this manner to avoid negative prices from wind, and it's certainly technically possible to do across the whole fleet. There's, like operating any plant flexibly, there's more wear and tear associated with that, so there's a slight increase in cost. But in our study, it also shows that if you can use the spare capacity from the nuclear plant when you ramp down to provide regulation or reserves, ancillary services, you can actually make more money. So revenues from nuclear operators could go up. And because they have very little fuel cost, the cost to provide reserves is lower than that for natural gas or coal. And so it leads to a shutdown of more coal or natural gas plants throughout the day in an interim case, and that saves CO2 as well. So it's kind of a win-win. It reduces curtailment of wind and solar, it increases revenues for the nuclear plants, and it reduces the consumption of fossil fuels in the mix.
Seems like
So that's the first one.
Good
The second
segue
one, I'm
into
just going to say, let me come back in 2 years for another seminar on that, because that is a contemporary topic that a lot of people are wrestling with, which is how do we design electricity markets for a world in which we have zero marginal costs? And that's a topic I'm researching, as are a lot of other people. There's a workshop that NREL is hosting in a few weeks out in Colorado on this topic. It's not an easy answer, and it's probably not one I have time to answer today, other than I should say there's nothing about the fact that they have zero marginal costs that mean that short-run marginal prices are not an efficient way to run dispatch. So I do think there's still a role for markets in that context, but the risk involved in long-term planning is very different, so we need to think about how to address that,
Jesse,
that challenge.
Your non-answers are almost as long as your short.
Sorry.
Who are we going to next?
When we build microgrids, one of the most cost-effective components to the project is typically energy efficiency, and I'm just wondering if that's on a micro scale, how does it impact what you're doing?
Yeah, so I skipped one of the graphics. So there's 2 graphics that lead off that Glenn Peters paper tracking progress towards 2 degrees. And one of them is energy intensity of the economy. So the total emissions is a product of energy per GDP times GDP, right, times CO2 per energy. So carbon intensity, and I'm focused on that piece, decarbonizing the energy supply, and then energy intensity, how much energy do we consume per unit of economic activity. And all of these plans, including the ones that require electricity to go to zero emissions, require an acceleration of our improvement in energy intensity. So there's a background rate of about 1% per year, historically, of improvement in how much economic activity we get out of a unit of energy. Partly that's energy efficiency and technological progress. Partly that's a shift away from energy-intensive sectors towards less energy-intensive sectors like services and finance. And in a lot of these studies, that rate has to double to 2% or more through concerted effort. And that's more than a doubling of effort, because only a portion of that 1% trend is due to policy measures or deliberate efforts to reduce, or improve energy efficiency. So I don't know what the share is. If it's 25%, that might mean we need 8-fold increase in our energy efficiency efforts to meet those kinds of objectives. And you still need solar and wind and nuclear and CCS to follow the trajectory that I talked about here. So it's an absolutely essential part of the equation. We have to accelerate our efforts on energy efficiency. But in a world with 9 going on 10 billion people, and with electrification of other sectors, we're probably actually going to see electricity demand go up despite those efficiency efforts.
So Jesse, I think you did a superb job pointing out the wisdom or need for all of the above or much of the above
Yeah, much of the
scenario.
above. All the low carbon of the above.
Yeah. So just focusing on nuclear and assuming that we can't relicense our way to this, this
Eventually,
future.
we'll have to shut down.
We'll
existing
need
fleet.
some new capacity, and the fact that new construction in today's technology equals or exceeds the market cap of most, even big utilities like an Exelon or merchant gen companies. What are your thoughts on the evolution of that technology or the use of innovative public-private partnerships, or is it modularization or
Yeah.
standardization of design? How are we going to get to that future?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So SCANA, the South Carolina utility that was one of the partners in building Summer Plant, is now trying to find a buyer and is on the verge of bankruptcy, and Westinghouse went down. So these are bet the farm type investments, and that really is a challenge to expect anybody to take on in a Western market run kind of context. So where we are building nuclear plants, large gigawatt scale nuclear plants, are in China, India, and the Middle East. In the UAE, for example, is building 5 or 6 reactors right now with the Koreans. And so these are places that are still government investment, big, balance sheets, low interest loans, planned economy type situations. And so that's where I think we're going to continue to see that technology still play a role in the future. But in the rest of the world, I do think that gigawatt scale is just too big in terms of its total investment cost, not cost per megawatt hour, but total billions of dollars of investment to probably be financeable, unless we see some nationalization of the U.S. Power system in the future or something. And so there are a lot of companies. There's over 24, I think, companies developing new reactor designs and trying to move at different stages through the process, and almost all of them envision smaller reactors, whether they're the 60 megawatt or 50 megawatt NuScale reactor, which is the next light water design that's small, modular, so it's still an evolution of current designs but much smaller, out of Oregon, that's working its way through the NRC, or next generation, quote unquote, 4th generation reactors that don't use light water technology, they use something else. And almost all of those are somewhere between 5 megawatts or 1 megawatt, even in Oklo's case, this nuclear battery company, all the way up to maybe 300 megawatt size. And that's designed to try to keep the construction risk down and the financing risk down, and also in many cases to enable manufacturability of the big components within a factory environment. So you can get learning by doing from having the same crew make every single one of the reactors instead of having to have these huge engineering construction projects. And in the United States, we're not very good at big engineering construction projects. So I think that's a pretty smart route to go down, and we'll just have to see how these companies proceed. And I think like we did for wind and solar, they deserve a push, and we should be supporting a few of them to move into the market and to see which ones work out.
Jesse, on the market designs that
Yeah.
are necessary to make your vision of the future economically feasible.
Yep, TBD.
I have no cue. Carl. I understand.
Hi, Jesse. Carl Husker, Kleinman Center and World Resources Institute. Though modelers who advocate the 100% renewable pathways, I think it's fair to say they sort of don't play on the same field that your modeling has, in the sense that rather than having a model that will optimize by choosing different power sources, they will say, just have a model that says, I only have renewables to select from, and then I'm going to find a way to balance load. And I think they will argue that, okay, I have a low levelized cost of energy, but I'm going to quantify integration costs. And by quantifying that, I'm now comparing burgers to burgers instead of banded burgers. Example, Jacobson did a global study, and he said, I can do all this renewable power for maybe $9 a megawatt hour, and my integration costs are less than an extra $1 a megawatt hour. There's a group of Finnish modelers who, put out all their numbers, and they quantify, LCOE, levelized cost of storage, levelized cost of transmission, levelized cost of curtailment. It all adds up usually to less than $10 a megawatt hour, which is then less than projections of nuclear and carbon capture on fossil. So just any comments on those approaches and what's behind them, why you might disagree?
Yeah, so 10 cents per kilowatt hour, $100 per megawatt hour usually, yeah. Yeah, so they are usually applying a different approach, not always. So the Bethany Frew study that I mentioned uses a similar type of optimization framework to look at this, Chris Clack's paper. But they do usually exclude a priori any other technologies. And so what we found in our literature review of over 30 deep decarbonization scenarios is that not a single one of the studies that allowed a wide range of options, in addition to renewables, selected a 100% renewable path. So even if we believe the numbers and the inputs that all go into these studies that are showing that we can do renewables, They're not showing that that's the most affordable or efficient or cost-effective or reliable way to get there, because they've excluded a bunch of options that, and when anybody else looks at this and they put them in the mix, show up in a pretty substantial share. So it's likely that even if we could get 100% renewable with for $100 a megawatt hour, we might, assuming a certain particular set of cost assumptions, we might be able to get there at $80 a megawatt hour with some nuclear or some large biomass or geothermal or whatever else. So that's one thing. And the second is that they're usually playing a different role, which is that they're trying to prove the technical and economic feasibility of this option rather than to show that it is the best option. And they usually are doing that under a very specific set of assumptions rather than try to saying, we don't know what the future is going to hold, let's kind of do uncertainty analysis and see what options we might want to keep open. And so as a technical exercise, an effort to show that this might be engineering or economically feasible, I think those are useful studies, and I've learned a lot from reading them. Where they become a little bit more problematic, or I have an issue with them, is when they start to be used as advocacy documents to say this is the best, I've proven in this scientific peer-reviewed paper that this is the best route, because that's most certainly not what they do. They've chosen the route that they want, they've shown that it's feasible, they've tried to calculate the cost for better or worse, but they're not doing the kind of studying that others in the space do. And what we find is that everyone, at least that I've found so far, every single study that includes a wider range of options and is picking the least cost mix includes other things besides renewables. So I think there's something telling there that we might want to pay attention to, that there's even if we see improvements in cost of these technologies, there's still a role for the other ones to play. And then I just say, each study has its own set of assumptions and we can quibble with whether they're realistic or not, but that requires unpacking individual studies.
So I have 3 hands, and if everybody's questions are short, everybody's questions are short, we're going to go all the way to the RNC having the first and the last word.
Okay, Jesse, thanks so much for this. I'm going to try to keep this short. So I'm now obsessed with landscape and partly working with Nick Pevsner, who's a landscape designer here. And it seems all these scenarios involve huge changes to the landscape. And I think a lot of energy politics, whether it's like pipeline politics, shale politics, have to do with landscapes. And so I've seen coming out of Holland an effort to really model out landscape design, thinking about this. Dirk Simmons, a book, Landscape and Energy, is like, the NIMBY trenches are where this could all die.
Yeah.
And you're at MIT where there are a lot of designers. I guess I'm wondering, have you seen conversations about trying to flesh out some of these scenarios in terms of design, both like political processes to make decisions in landscapes and fleshing out what they look like? I think to us, these numbers and these bars make a ton of sense. But if you're thinking democratic deliberations in the next 10 years, ordinary people, what are they actually looking at? And is this conversation gone beyond just like the cost forecasting? Yeah. Do you see your friends who are doing the visual stuff and the design stuff at MIT really thinking through what this would look like in terms of people's lives and backyards in the decades ahead?
Yeah, so there have been some efforts to look at the geospatial footprint of these renewable resources in particular, and how much land area they would do. Mark Jacobson's effort is one of the key advocates for that 100% renewables path at Stanford. Has tried to estimate what the total land area would be for his scenarios, and I have to say on the one hand, when you compare it to the total land impact of agriculture or forestry or the like, or even golf courses, it's a relatively modest amount of land. On the other hand, when you say we now have to take another 7% of Massachusetts' land area and cover it with wind farms, I have a hard time figuring out where we're going to put it. We can barely build any in the state. So I do think these are really key challenges, and it's part of why I think this sort of multi-objective framework is important. And all of these technologies have different impacts, and different people win and lose. And I think overall what we're likely to see is a system with much lower impact, because coal mining and oil production and gas pipelines, they all have a huge impact on our landscape, let alone the air pollution and spills and things like that. So my guess is the overall impact will probably decline, but it will move. Right? Because the same places that produce oil and gas today may not be the places that have to bear the brunt of the land use impacts of a low carbon system. And so these are really key challenges, and I do think it's an area where engineering and social science and design all come together, and a very productive area for further research and recommendations to guide us, because we don't have very good mechanisms in the US to work through these things. We either get the federal government to just roll through things with pipeline siting, and we can just build lots of natural gas pipelines, or we get this sort of very difficult process for siting transmission lines that have to move through every single jurisdiction and get approval along the way, and we just don't build transmission because of it. So there's got to be somewhere in between that can get the buy-in that we need to move forward at the pace that we need without just railroading over people. Okay, knocked it out.
Just a quick question about hydropower. And your previous slide, the 42, especially as an option for the Northeast and New England, knowing that neighbors in the North have so much capacity, hydro capacity that could be exported. So what will be the role and how, or in your view, how, I mean, what could be the dimension of